The stagecoach bucked Ilara Vance against the cracked leather brace for the 100th time, each jolt a punctuation mark in a sentence of misery that had spanned weeks. Outside, the Arizona Territory sprawled, a landscape painted in dust and despair, the sun, a relentless hammer against the canvas roof. Hope, a fragile seedling she had nurtured across a continent, withered in the furnace heat. Redemption, the town's name, whispered to her by the weary driver hours ago, felt like a cruel jest. There was nothing redeeming about the parched earth or the skeletal ribs of mountains in the distance. She clutched her small, worn valise, its contents the sum of a life she'd gambled on a stranger's promise, on the faded ink of Mr. Silas Blackwood's letters. Her past was a shadow that clung, even here, thousands of miles from the damp grey of the city orphanage and the subsequent years of drudgery and fear in servitude. A life where a woman's worth was measured by her silence and her ability to endure the casual cruelties of men who held all the power. Blackwood's proposal had been a lifeline thrown into a drowning pool. A simple farmer, he'd written, seeking a wife to share his quiet life, his small ranch. He'd sent a photograph, a man with kind eyes, lines of work etched around them, standing before a modest, sun-bleached cabin. The coach lurched to a halt before a long, low building that proclaimed itself General Mercantile, Assay Office, its paint peeled like sunburnt skin. A few horses drooped at a hitching rail, tails swatting languidly at flies. Men, faces carved from the same harsh stone as the land, turned to stare as Ilara descended, her traveling dress grey with dust, her bonnet askew. Their eyes were flat, assessing. She inquired after Mr. Blackwood, her voice a reedy thing in the oppressive silence. The storekeeper, a man whose belly strained against a soiled apron, merely grunted and jerked a thumb towards a stooped figure emerging from a darker building further down the single dusty street. "Sheriff Brody'll tell ya." Sheriff Brody's face was a roadmap of regret. He removed his hat, revealing a damp parté. "Ma'am," he began, his voice raspy, "I reckon you're Miss Vance." Ilara nodded, a knot tightening in her chest. "Silas Blackwood, he passed on, ma'am, 3 days back. Fever took him quick." The words fell like stones into a deep well. The dust swirled around her ankles, the sun beat down, and the world tilted. Silas Blackwood, her groom, her imagined salvation, was dead. She was adrift in this desolate place, her lifeline severed before she'd even grasped it. Penniless, alone. The few coins she had were barely enough for a meal, let alone passage back to a life she had no desire to reclaim. Brody looked uncomfortable. His place ain't much, and there's some question as to ownership now. He gestured vaguely. "You can stay at the boarding house, such as it is. For a night. Widow Parsons might have some mending work." The boarding house was a single, cramped room, shared with the snoring bulk of a freighter. The widow, a woman whose own hopes had long since turned to ash, offered no comfort, only a suspicious stare and a demand for payment up front. Ilara spent the night on a thin pallet, listening to the wind howl like a hungry wolf outside, the leers of the men in the street still burning on her skin. This was not redemption. This was the precipice of a new abyss. The next morning, driven by a desperation that overrode fear, she walked the 2 miles out to what had been Silas Blackwood's ranch. The path was little more than a pair of ruts in the unforgiving soil. The cabin, when she reached it, was even smaller, more weathered than the photograph had suggested. A forlorn sight, a testament to a life of hard-scrabble effort, now ended. Weeds choked the small patch that might have been a garden. The silence was profound, broken only by the caw of a distant raven. She pushed open the creaking door. Dust lay thick on everything. A single chair, a rough table, a cot. It was the meager legacy of a lonely man. As she stood there, a wave of desolation washed over her, so profound it nearly buckled her knees. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the doorway. Ilara spun, heart leaping into her throat. A man stood there, tall and lean, his features sharp, his skin the color of burnished copper. His dark hair was tied back with a leather thong. His eyes, though, were the most arresting, a startling light hazel, almost golden, set in that sun-darkened face. They were watchful, missing nothing. He wore buckskin trousers and a faded cotton shirt. He was not one of the town's rough whites. Half Apache, she guessed, from whispers she'd already heard about the breed who kept to himself on the edge of the territory. He carried no visible weapon, yet his presence filled the small cabin, radiating a quiet intensity. He looked at her, then around the sparse room. His gaze was unreadable, neither friendly nor hostile, merely observant. "You Blackwoods woman?" His voice was low, a gravelly timbre. Ilara swallowed, finding her own. I was to be Ilara Vance." He nodded slowly. Cale, just the one name. He surveyed her again, her city dress, her pale face, the tremor in her hands she couldn't quite conceal. Heard he was expecting someone. His gaze drifted to the mean cot. "This ain't what you expected." It wasn't a question. Before Ilara could respond, other voices, rougher, louder, intruded. 3 men on horseback rode up to the cabin, dismounting with swagger. One, a burly man with a florid face and small, cruel eyes, stepped forward, Jedediah Thorne. She'd seen him in town, his gaze lingering on her with an unpleasant familiarity. "Well now, what have we here?" Thorne sneered, his eyes flicking from Ilara to Cale. "Squatters already. Blackwood ain't even cold." He ignored Cale, focusing on Ilara. "This here's Blackwood's land, little lady, and since he ain't got no kin and no wife—" He let the implication hang. His companions chuckled. "I was to be his wife," Ilara said, her voice surprisingly firm, though fear was a cold snake coiling in her belly. Thorne laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Was to be don't count for much out here, missy. A piece of paper signed back east don't mean spit. This land needs a strong hand." His eyes roved over her, or a woman who knows her place. Cale shifted, a subtle movement, yet it drew Thorne's attention. "Stay out of this, breed," Thorne spat. "This ain't your concern." Cale's light eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "She's on Blackwood's land." He was a quiet neighbor. The implication was clear. Kyle had respected Blackwood, and by extension, his intended. "Quiet and dead," Thorne said, taking a step towards Ilara. "And she'll be leaving, one way or another." Kyle moved then, not with overt aggression, but with a fluid swiftness that placed him between Ilara and Thorne. He didn't speak, just stood there, a silent challenge. His stillness was more menacing than any shout. Thorne, for all his bluster, hesitated. He knew of Cale, knew the stories. Cale was not a man to be trifled with lightly. "You looking for trouble, Apache?" one of Thorne's men growled, his hand inching towards the pistol at his hip. Cale's gaze flicked to the man, then back to Thorne. "Just seeing a guest is treated with respect. This ain't your property, Thorne." Thorne's face flushed darker. He weighed his options. Taking on Cale here, now, might be more trouble than it was worth, especially with an audience. He forced a sneer. "This ain't over. That land, and anything on it, will be mine, sooner or later." He jerked his head at his men, and they remounted, casting venomous looks back before riding off. Silence descended again, thicker this time. Ilara found herself trembling, the aftermath of the confrontation hitting her. Cale turned to her. His expression remained stoic, but the sharp edges seemed a fraction softer. "They'll be back," he said, his voice flat. "Thorne wants this parcel. Water access, probably. Blackwood was too stubborn to sell." He looked at her, a long, assessing look. "You can't stay here alone. You're a target." "I have nowhere else to go," Ilara whispered, the fight draining out of her. He considered this for a moment. "My place is 1/2 a mile west. Small, rough. But Thorne and his kind, they mostly leave me be." He paused. "You can stay there, for now. Help with chores. Safer than this." It wasn't an offer of kindness, not exactly. It was a practical solution, stated bluntly. Ilara looked at this enigmatic man, this outsider who had, for reasons she couldn't fathom, just stood between her and a significant threat. She saw no pity in his eyes, but she also saw no deceit. She saw a reflection of the harsh land itself, unyielding perhaps, but also possessing a raw, unvarnished honesty. "Why?" she asked, the word barely audible. Cale shrugged, a slight movement of his shoulders. "Thorn's a maggot, and this land, it doesn't suffer fools or easy victims gladly." He looked towards the path Thorn had taken. "They'll think twice, coming onto my ground." He met her gaze. "Your choice." Ilara thought of the leering faces in town, the cold indifference of the widow, the desolate emptiness of this cabin. Then she looked at Cale. He was an unknown, a man of two worlds, belonging fully to neither, but in his eyes she saw a strength, a self-containment that Thorn, for all his bluster, lacked. "All right," she said, her voice small but clear. "Thank you." Cale merely nodded. "Get what you need. Not much daylight left." His ranch was starker even than Blackwood's, a small, solid cabin built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, a lean-to stable, and a corral holding a couple of wiry horses. A few chickens scratched in the dust. The land around it was rocky, punctuated by stubborn tufts of grass and hardy desert shrubs. It was a place built for survival, not comfort. He showed her to a small alcove off the main room, barely large enough for a narrow cot and a small crate for her valise. "This is it," he said. No apology, no embellishment. Life with Cale settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. He was a man of immense self-discipline and few words. Mornings began before dawn. He would already be out, tending to his horses or checking snares he set for small game. Ilara, initially clumsy and unsure, learned. She mended his worn clothes, cooked their meager meals over the small hearth, tended the tiny, struggling vegetable patch he'd reluctantly allowed her to start. She learned to draw water from the well, a task that initially left her muscles screaming. He watched her, his light eyes missing nothing. He never praised, but he never criticized her efforts either. One evening, after she'd successfully baked a passable loaf of bread in the crude stone oven, he'd taken a piece, chewed it slowly, and given a single, almost imperceptible nod. For Ilara, it was high praise. He began to teach her other things, practical things, how to read the subtle signs of the desert, the bent twig that signaled a rabbit's path, the distant dust cloud that meant riders. One afternoon, he took down an old rifle from pegs above the door. It was well-oiled, cared for. "You need to know how to use this," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. He showed her how to load it, aim, clean it. Her first few shots went wide, the kick of the rifle bruising her shoulder. He adjusted her stance, his touch impersonal but firm. Again. Slowly, her aim improved. He did the same with a skinning knife, not just for preparing game, but as a weapon of last resort. "Hope you never need it this way," he said, his voice grim, "but hope ain't a good shield." Jedediah Thorn and his men hadn't forgotten them. They didn't dare a direct assault on Cale's property. Not yet, but their menace was a constant presence. Twice Kyle found his fence lines cut. Once a precious water barrel was fouled. Each time, Cale's jaw would tighten, his eyes would grow colder, but he said little, simply repairing the damage with a grim patience. One evening, as the sky bled purple and orange, they sat outside the cabin. The silence between them was no longer strained, but companionable. Ilara had been mending one of Cale's shirts, the rough fabric familiar beneath her fingers. "Why did you stay?" she asked quietly, not looking at him. "After the army posts, the reservations, why here?" She knew fragments of his story gleaned from his rare, terse comments. His Apache mother, dead. His white father, a trapper, also gone. The years of being caught between two worlds, trusted by neither. Cale stared out at the darkening landscape. "This land," he said finally, his voice low, It doesn't care what blood you have, only if you're strong enough to hold on, or smart enough to listen to it. He picked up a small, smooth stone, turning it over in his calloused fingers. My mother's people knew this place. It speaks, if you're quiet enough to hear. Ilara thought of the life she'd fled, the noise, the judgment, the stifling expectations. Here, amidst the harshness, there was a brutal honesty she was beginning to understand, even appreciate. Another time, after Thorne's men had been seen lingering too close to Blackwood's now abandoned cabin, Cale returned late, a grim set to his mouth. He said nothing, but Ilara noticed fresh scratches on his knuckles. Later, she saw him cleaning his rifle with meticulous care. The unspoken tension thickened the air. A subtle shift occurred between them. One morning, she found a single vivid desert marigold placed in a chipped cup on the rough table where she ate. No words were exchanged, but her heart felt a strange, unexpected warmth. When Kyle gashed his arm badly while repairing the corral, she cleaned and bandaged it with a practiced gentleness, her touch lingering perhaps a fraction longer than necessary. His light eyes met hers, an unreadable emotion flickering in their depths before he looked away. These were the small cracks in their armor, fragile bridges built across a chasm of solitude and suspicion. The uneasy peace shattered on a moonless night. The chickens erupted in a terrified squawking, followed by the frantic barking of the half-wild dog Cale tolerated around the property. Cale was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. "Stay inside," he ordered Ilara, his voice a low growl. But Ilara had learned too much to huddle in fear. She grabbed the smaller rifle Kyle had insisted she practice with, her hands surprisingly steady. She could hear Thorne's grating laugh outside, the thud of hooves. "Cale, Apache, we know you're in there, and your little white bird. Send her out, and maybe we'll just burn you out. Otherwise, we're coming in." Gunfire erupted. A bullet splintered the doorframe near Ilara's head. Cale returned fire, a steady, measured response from the window. Ilara moved to another small opening, peering out. She could see at least 4 figures in the darkness, moving like shadows. "They're trying to flank the stable," Cale grunted, firing again. "Cover the back." Fear was a cold knot, but a new, harder resolve overlaid it. She sighted down the barrel as Cale had taught her. One of Thorne's men, emboldened, was making a dash for the lean-to where Kyle kept his meager winter supplies. Ilara squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked. The man cried out, clutching his leg, and stumbled back. Surprise, then a grim satisfaction, flickered through her. She had defended herself. She had defended this place. The fight was brutal, chaotic. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the shouts of men. Cale moved with deadly efficiency, a phantom in the dim light of the cabin, making every shot count. Ilara reloaded, fired, reloaded again, her actions becoming almost mechanical. She saw one of Thorne's men fall and not get up. The cost of survival was etched in flame and blood. Then, a cry from Cale. She spun. He was down on one knee, clutching his side, his face contorted in pain. Thorne, seeing his chance, charged towards the cabin door, a heavy axe raised. There was no time to think. Ilara leveled her rifle, but Thorne was too close, moving too fast. He kicked the door inward. It splintered, hanging crookedly. He loomed in the opening, his face a mask of triumph and fury. Cale tried to raise his rifle, but he was too slow, weakened. Thorne laughed, a raw, ugly sound. "Time to die, breed, and then your woman." Ilara didn't scream. She didn't freeze. The lessons Cale had drilled into her, the primal instinct to survive, the burning anger at this man who embodied all the predatory cruelty she had known, surged through her. She dropped the rifle and drew the skinning knife from the sheath at her belt. It felt small in her hand, but it was all she had. As Thorne stepped over the threshold, intent on Cale, Ilara lunged. She didn't aim for a killing blow, not consciously. She aimed for the only vulnerability she could reach, the only way to stop him. With all her strength, she plunged the knife deep into his thigh, twisting it as Cale had shown her when butchering deer. Thorn roared, a sound of pure agony and surprise. He staggered, dropping the axe, his eyes wide with disbelief as he looked down at the knife buried in his leg, then up at Ilara. Her face was pale, splattered with his blood, but her eyes blazed with a ferocity he hadn't anticipated. He had underestimated her, seen only a timid mail-order bride, not the survivor she had become. He clawed at the knife, but his leg buckled. Cale, seizing the moment, pushed himself up, ignoring the pain in his side, and brought the butt of his rifle down hard on Thorn's head. Thorn crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Silence descended, broken only by their ragged breathing and the distant, fading sounds of Thorn's remaining men retreating in disarray. The immediate threat was over. Ilara stood, trembling violently now, the knife still in her hand, slick with blood. Cale pushed himself up, leaning heavily against the wall, his hand pressed to his bleeding side. He looked at her, at the fallen Thorn, then back at her. A complex emotion flickered in his light eyes, respect, surprise, and something else, something deeper. "You did well," he said, his voice hoarse. It was the highest praise he could offer. Ilara dropped the knife as if it burned her. The strength that had surged through her ebbed away, leaving her weak and shaken. The reality of what she had done, what they had endured, crashed down upon her. They dealt with the aftermath in a grim, exhausted haze. Cale's wound, though painful, wasn't life-threatening, a deep graze from a bullet. Ilara cleaned and bandaged it, her hands surprisingly steady despite the tremor that ran through her body. Thorn was dragged outside, bound securely. One of his men lay dead near the corral. Another had fled, wounded. By dawn, Sheriff Brody arrived, drawn by the sounds of the prolonged gunfire. He took in the scene, the dead man, the trussed-up Thorn, Cale's bandaged side, Ilara's blood-stained dress and stark face, with a grim understanding. Thorn, he said, would be taken to the territorial jail. His reign of petty terror in the region was over. Few would mourn his absence. In the days that followed, a new quiet settled over Kyle's ranch. It was different from the silence of before, no longer laced with unspoken tension and the constant threat of violence. It was a silence of exhaustion, of shared trauma, but also of a hard-won peace. They repaired the cabin door, mended the fences, and buried Thorn's man in a shallow grave far from the house. The land Blackwood had owned, Brody informed Ilara, was legally hers. The letters, her journey, her presence before his death, gave her a stronger claim than anyone else, especially with Thorn out of the picture. She now owned that small, sun-bleached cabin and the parched acres surrounding it. Ilara looked at Cale. Their eyes met. So much had passed between them, much of it unspoken. The shared ordeal had forged a bond stronger than any words. He had offered her protection, and she, in turn, had fought fiercely to defend their small, shared world. "What will you do?" Cale asked one evening, as they sat by the fire, the desert night cool around them. Ilara looked at her hands, no longer soft and pale, but calloused and capable. She thought of the life she'd left, the life she'd almost had, and the life she had now. "I don't know," she admitted. "That cabin, it's mine, but it's empty." Cale finished for her. He understood. They didn't speak of it again for a while. Ilara continued her chores at Kyle's ranch. He continued to teach her about the land, about survival, but the dynamic had shifted. There was an ease between them now, a deep, quiet understanding. The trust, once so cautiously extended, was now absolute. He no longer saw her as a fragile Easterner, and she no longer saw him solely as an enigmatic protector. They were partners, survivors. One day, Cale rode with her to Blackwood's cabin. It looked even more forlorn than before. Weeds grew higher. The wind whistled through cracks in the walls. "It needs work," Cale said, his gaze sweeping the property. "Water's the main thing. Blackwood's well is shallow, mines deeper, more reliable. Ilara looked from the dilapidated cabin to Cale's sturdy, if small, homestead visible in the distance. An idea, fragile at first, began to take root. Two small, struggling ranches, two solitary people. Perhaps, she said slowly, two small places worked together might be stronger than one. Cale looked at her, his light eyes searching hers. He saw not the desperate mail-order bride who had arrived weeks ago, but a woman transformed. Her gaze was direct, her stance confident. The scars of her past were still there, he knew, just as his own were, but they were no longer her defining features. Resilience was, strength was. A rare, faint smile touched the corners of his lips. Perhaps, he agreed. Months turned into a year. They didn't move into Blackwood's cabin. Instead, they expanded Cale's. Together, they repaired the fences, deepened the well at Blackwood's place for watering stock, and cleared more land for planting. Ilara's small garden, once a desperate patch, flourished under her determined care and Kyle's knowledge of the desert soil. They acquired a few more head of hardy cattle. The memory of Thorn and the night of violence remained, a shadow in the corners of their lives, a reminder of the brutality of the world they inhabited. But it no longer held the power to terrify. It was a scar, a testament to what they had overcome. Ilara still slept with the rifle near, and Cale's vigilance never truly lessened, but fear was no longer their constant companion. She found a purpose she had never imagined, not in being a wife in the conventional sense, but in being a partner, a builder, a shaper of her own destiny on this unforgiving land. Her past trauma, the reason she had fled west, became a distant echo. It had shaped her, yes, but it no longer owned her. She owned herself. KL too seemed to find a measure of peace he hadn't known. The solitude he had once fiercely guarded now comfortably included her. His silences were often shared, his rare words carrying weight and sometimes an unexpected tenderness. Love was not a word they used. It was in the shared labor, the quiet evenings, the unspoken understanding that they faced the harshness of this life together. One evening, Ilara stood looking out over the land as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in hues of fire and amethyst. The wind, once a mournful howl, now felt like a familiar breath against her skin. This harsh, demanding land had, against all odds, become home. Not the gentle haven Silas Blackwood had promised in his letters, but something far more real, more potent, a place she had fought for, bled for, and helped to build with her own hands, alongside a man who understood the value of silence and the strength found in survival. Redemption. Perhaps the town's name wasn't so ironic after all. Not a redemption found in divine grace, but one forged in grit and resilience, in the courage to face the wasteland and carve out a life, however fragile, however scarred. The future remained uncertain, the land forever demanding. But Ilara Vance, no longer just a mail-order bride, faced it with her eyes open, her spirit unbroken, standing shoulder to shoulder with the half-Apache rancher who had offered her protection, and in doing so had helped her find herself. The long shadow of the past might always linger, but here, under the vast, indifferent sky, they were planting in ash and finding, to their surprise, that things could still grow.